Let me begin by reminding you why we had this tendency towards a natural order. The fundamental insight was that division of labor and human cooperation is beneficial for all people who participate in it. Division of labor implies higher productivity and provides mankind with a reason, so to speak, to peacefully cooperate with each other. Otherwise, if there would not be this higher productivity associated with division of labor, we would indeed get some sort of permanent war of each against each other. Mises writes, for instance, if it were not for this higher productivity of labor based on division of labor, men would have forever remained deadly foes of one another, irreconcilable rivals in their endeavors to secure a portion of the scarce supply of means of sustenance provided by nature. Each man would have been forced to view all other men as his enemies. His craving for the satisfaction of his own appetites would have brought him into an implacable conflict with all his neighbors. No sympathy could possibly develop under such state of affairs. And again, because of this higher productivity, this tendency is, so to speak, not necessary that people consider themselves as enemies, but can consider themselves as cooperative partner, if not even friends. And again, to hammer away on this point, let me once again briefly re-quote something that I have already quoted before in a slightly different connection, where Mises says that if one recognizes this principle of higher productivity, of cooperation based on division of labor, if one recognizes a principle which results in the union of all Germans or all proletarians and all forms of special nations, races or classes out of individuals, then this principle cannot be proved to be effective only within the collective groups. The anti-liberal social theories, the theories that somehow emphasize that there must be conflict between humans, the anti-liberal social theories skim over the problem by confining themselves to the assumption that the solidarity of interests within the group is so self-evident as to be accepted without further discussion, and by taking pains only to prove the existence of the conflict of interests between groups and the necessity of conflict as the sole dynamic force of historical development. But if war is to be the father of all things, the fruitful source of historical progress, it is difficult to see why its fruitful activity should be restricted within states, nations, races, and classes. If nature needs war, why not the war of all against all, and why merely the war of all groups against all groups? Now, so far, I have concentrated in all of my talks, with brief deviations, on what we might call productive activities. And let me briefly explain again what I mean by productive activities in order to contrast productive activities from what one might call parasitic activities. Productive activities are activities that increase the well-being of at least one person, reducing the well-being of other individuals. You realize that by this definition, we avoid all sorts of interpersonal comparisons of utility. This formulation is similar to the formulation of the so-called Pareto criterion, that also assumes that we cannot compare my happiness with your happiness. And if we cannot compare your happiness with my happiness, can we still say something about social welfare increasing or not increasing? And the answer is yes, we can do this if we recognize that if my well-being increases and through my activities the well-being of others is not decreased, then we can indeed say that social welfare has increased. And there exist three types of activities that accomplish this. That is, making at least one person better off without making anybody else worse off, and in the following sense. An act of original appropriation, that is, I am the first person to put some previously unowned resource to some use, is, in this sense, a Pareto superior move. It makes me better off, otherwise I would not have appropriated what I appropriate, and it does not take away anything from anybody else, because everybody else would have had the chance to appropriate the same thing, but they demonstrate through their own activity that they did not attach sufficient value to it. They did something else. So nothing has been taken away through an act of original appropriation from anybody else, but one person is definitely better off. Nobody else is made worse off as a result of it. The second type of Pareto superior move is to engage in acts of production. I use my own physical body with the help of originally appropriated resources and now transform something that was less valuable into something that I expect to be more valuable. Obviously, I am better off because of this, otherwise I would not have engaged in this act of production. And nothing is taken away from anybody else. Everybody else has exactly the same resources at their disposal that they had prior to my act of production. One person is better off, no one is made worse off. And finally, acts of voluntary contractual exchange also are productive in the sense that two individuals benefit from the exchange. Otherwise, this voluntary exchange would not have taken place. And again, no resources at the disposal of any third party are affected by this voluntary transaction between two individuals. So in this case, we have two individuals gaining in utility and satisfaction, and nobody losing in utility or satisfaction as a result of that. Because of this, these three types of activities can be referred to as productive activities, as activities that increase social well-being. In contrast, we have, of course, what we call parasitic activities, and I mean parasitic this time in a slightly different meaning from that I mentioned very early on as having been used by Carol Quigley. Remember, Quigley refers to parasitic activities as activities that somehow diminish the amount of goods in existence, like picking berries and not replacing it with anything. I would call this, under the current definition, as a productive activity. So he uses that term in a slightly different way, and at that time when I talked about that, the use of parasitic simply had a different explanatory purpose than the one that I'm using now. What I mean by parasitic in this context is activities that make some people better off at the expense of making other people worse off. And those activities would be obviously activities such as taking away what some other a person has originally appropriated, taking away what some other person has produced, or not waiting for the agreement of some potential exchange partner, but simply robbing him of whatever is his. In this case, we have, in all of these cases, we obviously have one person gains and another person loses. Let me briefly mention three typical parasitic activities that play a great role in history before I then come to a special form of parasitic behavior which is associated with the institution of the state. Parasitic behavior would be, for instance, in the most drastic form, cannibalism. That is, people simply eating another person up. It was, again, insight and intelligence on the part of people that led to the abolition of cannibalism. People realized that, yes, in the short run, cannibalism might be beneficial. But if you have slightly longer term perspectives, you would prefer slavery over cannibalism. This is indeed a stage of human development that for which we have anthropological evidence, that most cannibals realized at some point, after smarting up a little bit, that slavery was definitely superior over this, unless you are very, very hungry at this particular moment. So, but at least people even overcame this this delicious temptation and developed slavery. And again, it was rational thought, so to speak, that also overcame this institution of slavery, because they realized that slavery is, by and large, an unproductive system of human interaction. Again, slavery in the short run can, of course, be beneficial. If I can use you as my slave for a while, even if I would recognize that in the long run I would be better off if you were a free man and I would be a free man and we would cooperate with each other. In the short run, of course, slavery can have certain advantages. And again, it requires, so to speak, a certain development of intelligence, a certain lowering of our time preference, so to speak, in order to be willing to give up this immediate advantage that the institution of slavery might represent. Apart from slavery, of course, the most common form of parasitic behavior is plain crime and robbery and fraud and activities such as those. And again, we can say, of course, that the fact that most people abstain from these type of activities is based on insight, is based on the fact that they realize in the long run these things simply do not pay. If robbery would become, so to speak, a practice, we would all be in terrible shape. And we abstain even from engaging in robbery and fraud, even if we know that in the short run we might be able to get away with it. Again, insight, a certain amount of intelligence, a certain ability to delay gratification is necessary on the part of man in order to give up the temptations that these forms of parasitic behavior might represent. And because of this, because of a certain amount of intelligence and so forth, we have reached a stage where cannibalism has basically disappeared, where slavery has basically disappeared, and where fraud and robbery have become rare events conducted by just some few asocial individuals, and most people abstain from it. So civilization is maintained by rational insight, by having developed a certain state of intelligence and having lowered our time preference to a certain degree. And again, a quote to this effect by Mises, and then I will really come to the problem of the origin of the state, as I promised. Mises says here, "One may admit that in primitive men the propensity for killing and destroying and the disposition for cruelty were innate. We may also assume that under the conditions of earlier ages the inclination for aggression and murder was favorable to the preservation of life. Man was once a brutal beast, but one must not forget that he was physically a weak animal. He would not have been a match for the big beasts of prey if he had not been equipped with a peculiar weapon, reason. The fact that man is a reasonable being, that he therefore does not yield without inhibitions to every impulse, but arranges his conduct according to reasonable deliberation, must not be called unnatural from a zoological point of view. Rational conduct means that man, in face of the fact that he cannot satisfy all his impulses, desires, and appetites, forgoes the satisfaction of those which he considers less urgent. In order not to endanger the working of social cooperation, man is forced to abstain from satisfying those desires whose satisfaction would hinder establishment of societal institutions. There is no doubt that such a renunciation is painful. However, man has made his choice. He has renounced the satisfaction of some desires incompatible with social life and has given priority to the satisfaction of those desires which can be realized only or in a more plentiful way under a system of the division of labor. This decision is not irrevocable and final. The choice of the fathers does not impair the sons' freedom to choose. They can reverse the resolution. Every day they can proceed to the transvaluation of values and prefer barbarism to civilization, or, as some authors say, the soul to the intellect, myth to reason, and violence to peace. But they must choose. It is impossible to have things incompatible with one another."